Hello, my name's Dr. Peter Lovatt, and this is the Dr.Dance Happy Dance. Let's do it!
Having been a professional dancer himself who performed around the world with dance companies, Dr. Peter Lovatt was initially trained in ballet and then in other forms of dance. He is now a dance psychologist. His breakthrough moment came when he combined psychology and neuroscience with his passion for dance. He spent over 20 years as an academic in British universities researching the relationship between the body and the mind. He is the author of two books, The Dance Cure, published in 2020, and Dance Psychology, published in 2018. Peter developed and teaches two courses on dance psychology at the Royal Ballet School in London. Peter is sometimes known as Dr. Dance.
So first of all, I'd just like to ask you, how are you doing right now in these times? How are you feeling? Are you all right with your movement, with yourself? How are you?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because now we're in May 2020, and it's a strange time with the lockdown. So I'm in the UK, where we're all in lockdown, and we have been for about 2 months. And that's restricted our movement a lot. So physical movement, we can't move very far outside. We can't travel long distances. I'm used to traveling very, very long distances around the world. And so I haven't been traveling at all. And I haven't been traveling very much on a day-to-day basis. So I'm trying to do exercise and dance at home. But the evolution of that has been interesting because it's a very different style of movement. And of course, I've then been using this time to try to write a lot, which has meant even more constrained confinement, sitting at a desk, working and not moving. So the lockdown for me has been representing a long period of time, probably the longest period of time in my life, where there's been a restriction on movement. And that is, of course, having an effect psychologically too.
We've really restricted ourselves as human beings with our movements, haven't we? Why? How do you see that? What is it doing to us as human beings?
Well, I think as human beings, it closes us down on lots of different levels. So we know that some of the amazing things about movement are that it impacts on 4 areas of our life. So it impacts us socially, cognitively, so our thinking, emotionally, and physically. And of course, during this period when we're all locked down and we're changing our movement patterns quite dramatically, it's changing all of those things in all of those areas of our lives. So of course, socially, there are some people we're living with who we're spending more time with than we've ever spent with them before on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. And that has benefits and challenges all of its own. And then of course, we're distanced from our community, and we can see our community, but we have to be wary of them. So we're not allowed to approach them. We have to recoil from them if they get too close to us. And this has a huge impact on our social engagement and social interaction. And it fundamentally impacts the fabric of our societies. So at a social level, our change in movement is quite profound, or it's having quite profound effects. In our thinking, it's changing our thinking a lot as well, because we know that when we move our body, it changes the way that we think and solve problems. It changes how that whole idea of if you're sitting at home trying to write something and your mind gets stuck, then one of the amazing things to do is just to get up and go for a walk. But of course we can't do that quite so much now, which is difficult too. So that impacts our thinking and our ability to think and solve problems. And of course, in this lockdown and our financial lockdown and every kind of lockdown, and the fear of the pandemic, then of course there's a lot of thinking and problem solving we have to do, and we have to think about some new problems in new ways. Emotionally, of course, emotionally is very interesting, because the lockdown and the restricted movement is, I think, having 2 impacts on that. One is that we know that when people move their body and have shared movement and they rejoice through dancing, it can have an emotionally cathartic impact. So we can have a release of emotions, of pent-up emotions, which is wonderful. But the other thing that's happening at the moment is that we're locked down. And some people are reporting that during this lockdown period, actually for their mental health, some people who suffer from anxiety, are quite calm at the moment. Now, this might seem quite paradoxical, but they're reporting a level of calmness because although there are some new challenges coming in, lots of the old challenges of having to live up to certain expectations, of having to present themselves in a certain way to the world and do those things, some of those have been reduced significantly. And some people, this has led them now to a fear of the release, a fear of society opening up again. And suddenly there being lots of people and an expectation that while you've been off on this lockdown, you must have produced something amazing. You must have extended your career. You must have made your body the way that society has always wanted it, and all those things. So people are, I think, having a fear of the lockdown. So this change of movement is having two impacts. One, I think, very often we can't express ourselves, so we can't have that cathartic response. And secondly, some people are in this very calm space where they're afraid of being released from the lockdown. So those movements are having two different impacts. And finally, the fourth thing is with our physical self. I know at least anecdotally, people are talking about their body changing. They're not getting as much physical exercise and physical activity as they would like. And some people are putting on weight, and some people are reporting a reduction in their physical health and well-being as a consequence of that. So there are so many things going on for us at the moment. It's a real kaleidoscopic change that's going on.
Absolutely. With this thing, I think that one thing that the people who are feeling slightly better is also because they're they're getting the time to spend within themselves. I think because the movement that's happening otherwise, for example, when I came to London for work, it drove me mad because it's constant movement, It's quite stressful at times. You're running from one tube to the next, and you're walking, and then there's this. And I think within that, yes, our body is moving, but somewhere our minds aren't connected to our body, or our hearts aren't connected to our mind, or there's also that disconnection. And do you find that even before this lockdown, maybe a lot of times we're because again, there is so much emphasis on looking good all the time with our body, and a woman has to be a certain way, a man has to be a certain way, and in all societies this happens. And when we do go into movement practices, when we're doing ballet or when we're doing yoga, a lot of times it's become about how you look and how, about its beauty, or whatever beauty means to the society. And so that kind of disconnects us. What would you say about that? Is that true? Is it happening?
Well, it is, yeah, that disconnection of it's interesting you're talking about dancing and body image and body shape and size associated with dancing. So I think this speaks to the role of what we think dancing is. Now, it's certainly the case. I work at the Royal Ballet School in London, and there we're working with dancers who are at the highest level of ballet training in the world. And many of them are hoping to join the major ballet companies like the Royal Ballet Company and New York City Ballet, or the big ballet companies around the world. And of course, for those people, there's a certain expectation of body shape, body size for both the men and for the women, that they need to conform to a certain shape and size ideal. They're even x-rayed when they go to join, to make sure their bones are the right size and they won't grow too much. It's an extreme version. But then we think, well, that's what dance is. We think dance is about having this archetypal body shape. But of course, it fundamentally isn't. Dance isn't about classical ballet, and it's not about these art forms where it's extreme performative. Dance is the most natural thing in the world. The little tiny babies do when they wiggle and wriggle in response to music. It's that freedom of movement that we all have and experience. And so for that, we don't need literally any body, any shape, size body, any physical ability or disability. Whether you've got 2 arms or 1 arm or no arms, you can dance. Dancing is that universal thing. And once we get over this ideal that we have to have a certain body shape and size to engage with dance, dance will always be anxiety provoking.
And about dance psychology, that's something that's very interesting to me. What does a dance psychologist do?
Okay.
I'm very curious.
Well, well, dance psychology is the study of dance and dancers from a scientific and psychological perspective. So we're trying to understand dance and people who do dance from those different perspectives. And of course, what that gives us is an understanding of motivation in dance, why people dance, why they don't dance. We're looking at the health benefits of dance. We look at the relationship, trying to understand why do we dance? What is it about our genes and our hormones? Because in some cases, we are expressing our genes and our hormones as we're moving our bodies. So a dance psychologist is looking at dance and dancers from a psychological and scientific perspective, and then we can apply it in different areas. So we can apply it, for instance, in education. So if we're working with elite level dancers, we can help them to develop mental skills through dance to make them even better dancers, whether that's performing dances, whether that's creating dances, or whatever that is. So we're trying to understand that. We might work in school way education, so non-dance based education. So we work in schools looking at the relationship between movement and learning in the classroom. So how can we optimize people's learning of geography, of history, of environmental studies by introducing movement into those patterns and processes? Why do we have schools where people just sit in rows, and universities where they sit in rows for hours and hours and hours, expecting all this stuff to go into their head? So we do that. And then we look at business as well. So understanding in a business environment, how can we optimize the movement in the workplace to make that a better workplace? So we've worked with people like museums, trying to understand, the flow of people around a museum to go to all the different exhibits. How do we engage the gallery staff in that process? Not dancing, but looking at movement patterns and understanding that. And of course, there's a huge research side. So there are people working in universities as dance psychologists doing the hard science, looking at what's happening in the brain when people dance, looking at people in healthcare settings like people with Parkinson's disease, trying to understand why is it the case that somebody with Parkinson's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disorder, comes from the brain. Why is it that when those people dance, why do some of their symptoms become significantly improved? And trying to understand that from a scientific perspective, what happens to your brain and your body when you move your body? So looking at that relationship. So dance psychologists, and then of course we have dance psychologists who work with, dance companies or contemporary dance companies or Indian classical dance companies, thinking about, choreography, thinking about creativity, thinking about inventing new movement patterns and trying to understand how audiences respond to those different movement patterns. So it's a very varied and exciting field.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And there's so much going on within that. Have you yet worked with any children about with movement and learning, or any or in businesses? And I'm very interested in knowing if you personally worked with anyone who had no idea or no interest whatsoever about in dance or in movement, but had some sort of or felt some sort of change. I'm very interested in knowing about that. Any studies?
Okay. Well, there have been lots of those, which have been really interesting. So one of the things I've been doing for the last 10 years is working with groups outside of universities, trying to understand the benefits of dance. And of course, for those people who are not dance advocates, so those people who are non-dancers, who don't know about dance, they don't have a passion for dance. Of course, to work with those people, at the beginning, it can be quite difficult, because we go to them, we say, hey, if you dance in a certain way, we can help you improve other things that you're doing, like playing sports or studying in the classroom or your health and well-being. And they tend to say, oh, no. They say, of course it can't help. There's no way, how could that? They just don't know. They just go, no, it's rubbish. We don't know, it's rubbish, we don't believe it. So what we have to then do is to create movement patterns and ways of moving that people then understand. We have to do some education with people about movement, about what movement is and what dance is. So if we call it movement, then people are happy to do it. If we call it dance, they won't do it, even when we get them doing exactly the same things. But what we've seen in those kinds of environments, in schools, there was one school that I worked with where they introduced, there were several schools. Okay, so let me go through different schools. There was one school that had a problem with the parents, the teachers, and the children. It was a primary school, so it was a school for young children. These were, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, and it was in a very deprived area, and most of the parents of these children, after they'd left school, they'd had children very young. They'd never had jobs. The vast majority never had jobs. They had no aspiration. They had no career. They had no money. They then had children. The children were going to school. The teachers were trying to educate the children, and the parents were kind of going, "Oh, look, we don't care. It's nothing. What good's it going to do them? It did me no good. How's it going to do them any good?" And there was a big breakdown between the three groups. And so we used dance with them to bring those three groups together. And we set up an evening where we had, the young children were there, the parents came, and the teachers were there. And I used dance with all of them to bring the people together. Now, we didn't say to them, we're going to try to bring you all together by dancing, but we brought them in, we gave them pizza, and then we had them dancing. We got them interacting with one another. And it was really quite extraordinary, because after that evening of dancing, of interacting with each other, where they were laughing with each other, they were touching each other, these were the parents and the teachers, we were dancing together, sometimes in hold, sometimes open, but as a group. Sometimes it was child-centric, so we did some child-based movement, and then we sent the children out and we did some adult-based movement with everybody else. And then afterwards, the parents and the teachers were then communicating with each other. So when a teacher then had to go to a parent and say, "Oh, I need to talk to you about your child," the parents were like, "Oh, of course, let's have a chat." And there was an engagement immediately. So we started to use that science with the school groups there to bring them together. And that led to a fundamental change in the culture of the school, and it started to get them. Because very often with these things, you just have to bump start it. You have to do something to break the patterns that people are in. Another example of a more longer term was another school where there were children, again, in a very deprived area. And the children, there was a high rate of absenteeism from school. So the children weren't attending very often. When they went in, they weren't really concentrating. There was some bullying going on, there was pushing, and nobody really cared very much. And so the school introduced ballet, and the children had no money. And the school were given some money because the parents came from such deprived backgrounds. And the school then spent some of that money on providing ballet classes for everybody in the school. And they became compulsory for the whole school. And at first people were going, "No, this is such a waste of time, it's a waste of money." But they brought in this idea, and it changed the discipline in the school and the culture within the school within about 6 weeks. Because all the children were having the discipline of standing, of breathing, of moving their arms, of doing a shared all together, a similar experience all together. And then they were brought out of even their reading and writing classes to come and do ballet. So the hierarchy of what was important changed, and attending these ballet sessions became one of the most important things. Very often in our society in the UK, dance is the lowest. It's the lowest form of there's science first, and then there's humanities, and then there's the arts, and then within the arts there's music, which has a high value, then there's drama, and then there's dance right at the very, very bottom. That's generally how it is, our culture. But when we suddenly elevate dance and make dance the most important thing, and we say, look, this ballet is even more important than reading and writing, it's more important than science for a certain period of the day, it changed the culture entirely. And what the school found was that the behaviour of the children changed, the children's engagement with the learning activities changed, and the cooperation between the children changed, and levels of absenteeism went right down. So children wanted to come to school. Wow. And it changed that. So there are lots of these examples. Now, these examples would have both had many people, both in the management of the organizations and participants in the organization, who would have said, dance has no value. This isn't going to address these problems. But it does. And when you eventually get, when you demonstrate these things, or people when they see the benefits for themselves, they see the change, and it's them who are going, oh, look, this has changed fundamentally. Then, of course, you get buy-in. And we've seen that in education, we've seen it in healthcare settings, and we've seen it in business-based settings as well.
On the topic of dance being the lowest of all, and I think that happens exactly. I mean, I had no idea that you would say that being in the UK, or I'm in Italy right now, and people say the same here. You know, there's nobody's interested in dance first. And as a Pakistani, I could easily say the same. I want to understand why is it that we don't encourage dance or movement so much? Is it about power? Is it because it's about the body and we might become freer in our minds, in ourselves? And I don't know, maybe it's something that's coming from, centuries ago, but what is this taboo? Why not dance?
Yeah. I don't know is the short answer. I don't know why that is the case. My assumption is that, I would like to try to understand whether dance has a similar hierarchical position in countries where lots of men dance. So I don't know where places like South America, where men are more likely to dance perhaps, and it's more socially acceptable for men to dance. And in places, in certain parts of North Africa, well, all over Africa, where dance is such an integral part of the culture for both men and for women. But certainly in the society that I grew up in, it seems to be the case that I don't know whether dance has been diminished because we have a patriarchal society, where historically we've had a patriarchal society. The men are at the top, the women are at the bottom. And in many cases, dance is seen as a female-based activity. It's seen as something that only women do. And within that, it's sometimes seen as something that only young women do. And of course, again, we get to this other position of hierarchies. If you, in a patriarchal society where you have men sit above women and then adults sit above children, then an activity that is primarily done by female children is then partly seen. That might be one of the reasons why it's given that position in the hierarchy of the arts. Now, I recognize this is, it should be ridiculous. It should be utterly ridiculous, because we know that both men and women are born to dance. All humans are born to dance. We communicate through dance and movement, and it's something that it's innate. I mean, it's innate in the way that our language is innate. We learn these different language patterns, but our ability to produce language is innate, and our ability to produce movement and dance is innate. I mean, there's no culture anywhere in the world where people don't dance, and we think people have been dancing since before they had verbal languages. So we think dance has always been an integral part of the fabric of our society. Now, when I go to Northern Europe, I get lots of groups of men who say, well, we're not going to dance. And I say, oh, well, why not? And they say, well, they don't quite know why, but they say things like, well, dancing is associated with a sexuality that I don't want to identify with. So they think it says something about the sexuality, or they think it says something about their femininity. Both bonkers. But when I get them moving, I think my largest group of people I've ever had moving was just over 10,000 people in one room. And we had 10,000 business people dancing in their business suits. And to see that, and then we've worked, but then when you look at when you look at highly masculinized versions of dance, like rugby players doing the haka, bum, 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 bah, all that kind of real extreme war dances, and how men used to use dance as part of a war dance, as a way of bonding people together and instilling fear in other people. Then, of course, men go, but that's not dancing. Dancing, as far as I can tell, is wearing something pink, wearing something frilly, and looking like an archetypal young girl. Now, the other thing that really gets me, which I find really irritating, is that dance shops, so shops that sell dancewear, are almost entirely pink and frilly. And I've got two sons, and my two sons, I've got an adult son and I've got a younger son. And I can't yet. My 7-year-old son, he does ballet at school. He's the only boy that does ballet, and at the moment he doesn't mind that. He doesn't even notice. But I can't take him into a ballet shop in London because all the ballet shops are just female. They're designed around to appeal to 9-10-year-old girls rather than to a 7-year-old boy. And I went into one shop to get some gear for him, and I tend not to notice it anymore, for myself. But for him, there was one. I've taken photographs of it. There was one rail that was about this wide with boys' clothes on, and the rest of the entire shop, the whole shop, was for girls' clothing. And you think, goodness gracious me, So I think we start this idea when they're really young of indoctrinating them into the idea that dance is for young women and not for boys, and certainly not for men. And then, of course, that then feeds through to this idea that, oh well, if it's just something that little girls do, it's not important enough. Even so, one. I know. I'll move on. I promise. I'm talking.
No. Please, I want to hear.
Okay.
Speak. I love it. Thank you.
So we don't genderize. We don't generalize music quite so much. Music in school is for both boys and girls, and there's orchestras where all the boys and girls, they play together. They have different instruments. It doesn't matter whether you're a girl or a boy. You can still play the violin or the flute, or it doesn't matter what your gender or your sex is for your musical. But it does seem to matter about dance. And so I'm trying to work hard to demonstrate. This is something we're doing in dance psychology, to show people the power of dance. It is an extraordinarily powerful medium to work with. And when we can show people that when people engage in dance, it changes their thinking and learning, it changes their social bonding and interaction, it changes them emotionally and physically, then I think people will then start to pick dance back up again, I hope, and to use it more readily.
When your children are young, you do sort of encourage them to be imaginative, and you tell them stories, and you kind of encourage that imagination in them. But maybe you wouldn't do that as a parent when they grew up, but other parents, a lot of other parents, somehow push that imagination away. Then it's all about just study, just make money, do your job, get married, have children, and die. After that.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
If you don't allow the child to then be imaginative ever, then even if it's a young girl, I grew up to a young woman now. If I dance, of course, I know for Pakistan, it's also a lot of the religious hindrance, where we're an Islamic country, and then there's this question about, are we even allowed to dance?
Yeah.
So I understand that whole thing goes into another direction, but then it becomes about sexuality somehow, and not really allowing your child, who's not a child anymore, to be imaginative. Why are we doing that, and how are we doing this?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? As we talk about creativity and imagination, while you were talking about that, it just brought to mind this idea. In Japan, they used to, years ago, bind people's feet. So they would tie their feet up so they wouldn't grow properly. This is basically what we're doing with human beings. When we don't allow them to be imaginative and creative, we bind them, their whole bodies and their imagination has become bound. Now, of course, this happens physically and mentally. So we allow very young children to be imaginative. We allow them to be silly and to be creative, and they can invent worlds in their heads, and they can do this stuff. And we let them move and go, they can move all over. That's great. And then we start controlling them. And it's normally when they go to school, because we then control them, first of all, physically. So we say, no, sit down, keep sitting down, don't move, sit down and be still while the teacher tells you something. And so the teacher then tells them something, and they're not allowed to move. They're sat, they move. And then of course, when the body is restricted, then we're not allowed to. You can't express yourself. You can't walk down the high street and be walking down the high street like this. People would think you're crazy. But I think that we're crazy because we don't do that. We walk, we're sensible. So when we constrain the movement, I think this is having a terrible consequence on our imagination and our thinking and our ability to think. And we have to release people. We have to let people move their body naturally. because I think then when they feel that urge to move, we synchronize with one another. You know, could you imagine restricting a group of orangutans in the jungle? You know, orangutans want to be swinging, they want to be stretching and expressing and moving their bodies. And if you said to an orangutan, no, you mustn't do anything, this is what we're like as humans. We're like restricted orangutans. We're not allowed to move anymore. And when people discover that movement, the freedom of movement, oh my word, we get some real emotional and you know, some major changes in people.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we also do, I mean, there are a lot of different reasons of, you know, people feeling depressed more and more now. But I think this is one of the biggest reasons as well. We're just not allowed to be vulnerable, or we're not allowed to be, especially with our bodies, not just in the public. I'm not saying I should go in the street and express how I feel immediately. Of course, that would be difficult for people to deal with. But even with our loved ones, we're told to just stay quiet, you know, and don't cry, don't feel angry. It's a lot about searching for happiness all the time in life. And I feel, do you feel that we can't reach happiness unless we accept the negative emotions or the darker emotions, and also through body and movement?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to have intellectual and emotional freedom. I don't know what, I mean, if happiness is a sense of contentedness, then the contentedness has to come from that range of emotional ups and downs. You know, if you're just, you can't be a monotone. I know people sometimes want to regulate their emotional, you know, they want to regulate that emotional wave up and down to make it, you know, less wavy. You can't obliterate all emotional states, and you can't be neutral or happy, or neutral or happy, or neutral or happy. Sometimes you have to then go below the line as well and be unhappy, and there is that kind of movement in those things. And again, I guess that goes back to that sense of understanding natural rhythms. And if you've got a rhythm, it isn't just about the rhythm of your body, it's about the rhythm of your mind and the rhythm of your emotional state, and how those things come together. Yeah, I couldn't imagine ever being happy without experiencing unhappiness. I think that was a false. And I think the same was with movement. We can't, because sometimes movement feels awkward. Sometimes it feels hard to move and to expose ourselves and to have other people respond to our movement and our noise and the noise we make. Sometimes we're noisy creatures, and sometimes we're quiet creatures. And sometimes our noise will upset or offend other people. And so one of the natural things might be to think, well, you know, if our movement might offend somebody, and if our noise might offend somebody, and if our emotional response might offend somebody, then the easiest thing to do is to not show anybody any of those changes. But then, of course, you know, we're designed like a sponge to express. You know, we need this stuff to come out, and if it doesn't come out, then we can be left in a tricky place. But there's all those psychological studies of a little girl who was strapped to a chair for several years, the early part of her development. I think her name was Jeannie. In America, she was literally tied up to a chair 23 hours a day. And her development was obviously extremely stunted, emotionally, physically, in all kinds of ways. And this is, in some sense, a metaphor for what we are like in our lives if we constrain ourselves too much. You know, by constraining ourselves, we don't learn to express, and then it has a negative impact then, I think, on all parts of our lives.
What's the connection that the audience makes with performers? Why do they like something, or why do they not like something? Or is it a lot about entertainment also, or is it about being able to think as an audience when we watch dance?
Yeah, well, there have been some interesting studies looking at the way audiences respond to dance. Now, one of the wonderful things about dance, of course, is the way we can communicate. So we can communicate emotional states through moving our bodies. And when you have a large group of people or a small group of people communicating emotions or communicating ideas or whatever people are communicating, the audience are able to pick this up. Now, there's a notion in neuroscience looking at mirror neurons. And the mirror neuron idea is that, let's imagine you're doing something and you're performing an action and I'm watching you perform that action. Well, apparently while you're performing that action, your brain state will change to facilitate you doing that action. And what's extraordinary is that when I'm watching you do the action, my brain state will start to mirror your brain state as I'm watching you do this. So there's kind of an empathetic linking between you and I, even when you're doing it through movement and expressing yourself through some kind of movement, expressing an idea. So of course, what's happening with an audience is very often they're picking up a similar brain activation, which is giving them a stimulus for feelings, a stimulus for ideas, and a stimulus for all kinds of things that is mirroring what the dancers are doing and communicating. Now, for me, when I watch something like 42nd Street, the great tap dancing show, and there might be 40 or 50 dancers on stage, when they're all tapping and they're all in synchrony and performing together, oh my word, my body feels like, it crackles with excitement. My whole body feels like I'm dancing and I'm part of that experience and my body is moving. And so I leave the show feeling like I've had this mental workout as if I've been one of those dancers on the show. Or if I'm watching a ballet like Manon, that was choreographed by Sir Kenneth Macmillan, it's a passionate ballet, oh my word. And the emotion and the drama in this thing. It's like I'm inside the relationships that are being portrayed on stage. There's that thing. And when people dance spiritually, or they're dancing and they're communicating something to do with the gods, or to do with some lesson or something that's really important to people's hearts, then of course they're picking up that message too. So in many ways, dance, and because it's a universal language, our brains are picking up these movement signals and can understand what's going on. And it affects us. It's affecting our brains. It's affecting us directly. Then we are mainlining that story into somebody else's head, and that they then feel throughout their whole body. So I think dance as an audience member, it's an extraordinarily powerful thing. And this is in some ways why, there are some dance forms where people, that are so new and they're so contrived performatively, so abstract that people don't understand them. And then of course you get people being cross and angry with the art form because they don't understand it and they don't know how to respond, or the response isn't natural. So all of those things, I think, as we're watching people dance, are extraordinary. And I know it's the case that dance is not just about the sexual side of dance, but there is a relationship-based element. And there is some research which suggests that when we move our body, we're communicating something about our hormonal and our genetic state, so that people who are watching us move, for both men and women. So men are communicating something about their testosterone levels through the way they move, and women are very often, or can be, communicating something about their hormonal state, that other people, when they watch them move, have an understanding about the nature of their hormones while they're moving. So we are set up with the equipment to watch people move, and we communicate that, so which makes it so strong. And then of course one other thing, I'm talking about it, but one other thing, when you're performing, and you must know this yourself, when you're performing a dance piece, there's a connection between you as a dancer and the audience who are watching you, which is it's such an extraordinary bond during that time. It feels like there's a physical connection between you when you're performing and the people who are watching you perform. And there's, it becomes like a puppeteer and a puppet. You have that relationship between you. As you move on stage, you're affecting what's happening inside the heads of the members of the audience, which is extraordinary.
Absolutely. But don't you feel, Dr. Peter, that sometimes the way our auditoriums or theaters are made, we're really separated from, as performers, we're really separated from the audience. And so this idea of watching it just as entertainment sometimes, I feel that we all, as performers, as artists, we all have different contributions to make to the art world, to the society. Not everybody has to think of it in a lot of depth, and not everyone has to think of it as, being perfect with their body.
Yeah.
Of course, we're all different, but at the same time, sometimes there's this thing of just you are there and I'm here, and we don't kind of.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That sometimes you do get that. In traditional theatres, you get that. Now, a marvelous choreographer will be able to work with that space and create movements that are good for that space. So when there was a show in London called Cats many years ago, the 1980s, that came out, and it was in the New London Theatre. Now, the theatre was extraordinary because the dancers could come through the auditorium onto the stage, and there was an interaction then between them and the audience. There was when Cats was then produced at the London Palladium, then of course it didn't work at all because it was such an awkward combination that the show needed the audience to be more intimate. But also, when you think about dance performances, it's not just about traditional proscenium arch theatres. You get street dance battles that happen. So in street dance battles, you get people coming together in a more urban environment, a street-based environment, and people are watching each other dance, and they're immediately close to one another because it's in the street. They're physically close, and you get that, and you get all kinds of dance environments where we can dance more naturally in more open spaces, and the dance can become part of or they can be more immersive within the society in which it's there. So not all performative dance has to happen on a stage where it's separate from an audience. But I do hear what you're saying, that when we do have that separation, sometimes it can feel distant. There was a study that found that when an audience stood up, so when audience members were standing up rather than sitting down, then they felt more socially close. They felt more swayed by the movements of a dance piece than when they were sitting down. So even something like getting people standing up, which then raises their heart rate a little bit, changes the way people interact with dance and changes the way they experience the people on the stage. It does seem very sort of, from a UK perspective, a sort of Victorian puritanical sense, isn't it, with dancing? Charles Darwin argued that dance forms part of the human mate selection process in the way that dance forms part of the mate selection process for some birds, birds of paradise, something. So you get these birds who are dancing and they're communicating to one another through the movement. And humans, according to Charles Darwin, did something similar. We do something similar. And when we try to ban people from dancing, the Christian churches have done it as well. They've banned dancing too because they thought it was immoral and it was something that might titillate somebody, or you might seduce them with your movements. You might stir up and arouse passions in people, by moving your body in a certain way. So you better cover it all up and keep it still, because then you won't inflame anybody's. Which in a way is, of course we're not advocating. Well, I'm not advocating anything, but thinking about dance, that's one aspect of dance amongst all the other aspects and uses of dance. And to control somebody for their whole lives because of one tiny part of their life, the sexual aspect, does seem a little bit extreme, whatever else you believe in.
What is movement to you personally?
Okay, well, movement to me is life, I think. I think the main difference between being alive and being dead is movement. When you're alive, your heart beats, which is a movement, and your brain moves, and parts of you might move. But it's about movement, and we know that the human brain is set up it's specialized for movement. There's a huge areas of the brain responsible for our movement and our proprioception feedback and for all that stuff. So for me, movement is life to me. And for me to feel alive means to be moving in some way or changing my movement. Now, movement has played very important parts in my life right the way across my life so far. I'm currently 55, and so for at least 50 years, I've been consciously aware of movement and the importance of movement to many aspects of my life. One, I think, of the most important aspects is the relationship between movement and my own mental health. And for me, that is, I think, one of the most important things. When I dance, then some of that sense of the pressure cooker of the mind, the darkness of the mind, can be lifted. And I've experienced times where my mind has been so overwhelmed with thoughts that I can't get those thoughts in order. And of course, when that happens, then dark clouds come over and there's all sorts of not very nice experiences happen. And what I've always found with those experiences is that when I dance, then that changes. I've had periods of my life where I didn't dance, and these have been the sort of darkest periods of my life. But these have been periods where I've been, working very hard academically, trying to achieve something, where I've thought that I've had to give up dancing and moving to be able to concentrate on something, which is always the wrong thing to do, I find. And what I found is that when I've been in those very dark periods, my wife, she's very good. She'll prod me and she'll say, go and dance, go and dance. You need to go and dance, go and dance. And those are the times where I'm saying, I don't need it, I don't want to dance, I don't need to dance, I don't want to dance. It's not, no, I just don't feel that. And I go and I dance, and I do go and dance. And it's extraordinary. I mean, the change that happens, it just takes a short period of time sometimes. And the mist clears completely. It's like a pollution that covers you. And for me, when I dance, it's like having clean air around me. The difference is there. And of course, this happened, when I was at school. I write about this in the book. When I was at school, I struggled with reading and writing. And so for me, sitting at a desk, trying to learn to read and write was horrible. I mean, horrible in so many ways, because I simply couldn't read and write in the way that other children could. And so when you can't engage with children, you can't engage with material in that way, then of course you fail constantly. You fail over and over again because you don't learn, you fail. But I was so lucky that my school had a dance group, and I went along and I joined the dance group. I was the only boy for a long time as part of that. But when I danced and I was in the school hall dancing, my world felt different. My mood was lifted. My relationships were different. My heartbeat, it was beating, and the life force was going through my body, and I felt truly alive. And then I'd go back and I'd sit in the classroom again, and the mist, the polluted air would just fill my head, and it would just feel horrible. And so as a child, I was so lucky to have found dance, or dance found me, I think, to be able to dance. And I eventually learned to read and write through dancing. But then as an adult, then dance has been really important for controlling mental health and mood and my engagement with other people. So across my life, dance has played a fundamentally important role. And it's sometimes been a struggle because dance isn't high up in the hierarchy of what's important in life. It's quite hard to make a living for yourself across your whole life as a dancer and being involved in the dance world. But what I've always found is whenever I felt I had to leave the dance world to make some money, then actually the most important thing to do was to stay in the dance world and keep dancing, because that's where, when you're in that space and you feel engaged and you feel alive, then that's where you can have a career. And then when you have a career, then some little bits of money come in. So yeah, the dance is fundamentally important in virtually every aspect of my life.
You almost helped yourself with your dyslexia, with your learning disabilities, and you really helped yourself through what you understood about dance, about movement. And how did you manage to do that for yourself? That's very brave of you. And it's amazing that you kind of created that space for yourself.
That change it just takes a moment. There's a momentary change. So for me, that difference was, so I struggled with reading and writing and failed at that lots of times. I failed on my written exams and failed at that. dancing meant I was good at dancing and I succeeded at dance, and I had a model of how to be successful as a dancer. But I still felt stupid, because when you can't read and write, you come out of the school system and you F fail. I had a big chip on my shoulder thinking that I was stupid and thinking that I was a failure. Well, I was a failure, but thinking that I was useless, thinking that I was incapable of learning. And then it occurred to me one day when I was rehearsing a show in London that actually being able to learn long movement patterns, being able to watch other people move and to take those inside my head, to learn them and to remember them, and then to perform them with expression and be able to communicate with an audience ideas and emotions through body movement. There was one day where I thought, well, I can't be stupid. And it sounds almost ridiculous, but when you have this notion and you go, okay, well, I'm not stupid then. I'm not stupid. And then you think, okay, well, if I'm not stupid, then how can I try to overcome this difficulty that I've got here? And then the hard thing after that is then, because when you define yourself as stupid and when you fail and you define yourself as a failure in lots and lots of ways, then other people see you as a failure, and other people don't expect you to be able to learn, and they don't expect you to be able to succeed, and they don't expect all that. So then you have to go through the change of mindset of thinking, okay, so I'm not stupid, and if I'm capable of learning all of this stuff, I must be capable of learning all of this stuff. I must be able to learn to read and write. And then you have to then deal with all the other people. You say to them, oh, I'm going to learn to read. And they go, no, of course you can't. You're the stupid one. You can't learn to read and write. You're thick. You can't learn. Or they go, ha, 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 you'll never do it. Those of us who can do it have obviously got something that you haven't got. And then you just have to get into this sense of being a bit stubborn. And you have to want to do it. And I guess it's like people who decide to climb to the top of Mount Everest, or they decide to swim into the deepest ocean, or they decide to do something that it's a mindset change. And when you change that mindset and you accept that you're not going to succeed immediately, and there's that failure, repetitive failure, is going to be part of that journey. And I think that's one of the things I learned from dance, because of course, as a dancer, every day in class, you get corrections from your teachers who say, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. We know you can do it right, but that's not right. Do it again, do it again, do it again, do it better, do it again. And then, so I had that skill of being able to think, okay, well, I can't read and write, but I'm going to work out what I can and can't do in reading and writing. Because I could read, the car is red. I could read that. But I couldn't understand, a word like rhythm. I mean, my wife has to correct my spelling of rhythm. I can't spell rhythm. I can't spell the word yacht. I can't spell words where the spelling doesn't match the sounds that it makes. I just can't do those things. And then I had problems with understanding long distance dependencies. So I could read the car is red, but I couldn't read or understand the car that was parked next to the bank that was robbed yesterday by 3 men wearing balaclavas was red, because I would have no clue what was red. Was it the bank that was red? Was it the balaclavas that was it the men who were red? What was red? I would simply have no clue. And so in those kind of things, language would just trip me up constantly. So I think in the end, I felt like it was a complex dance pattern that I wasn't going to learn immediately, but a dance pattern that I could learn eventually if I engaged with it in a certain way. And of course, you have to then convince the other people around you by showing them that you're not going to give up, that you're not going to be intimidated by other people, and that you're going to keep working really hard. And so that's what I did. And it was a struggle to learn to read and write. And the time, and what was most interesting was, for me, I think, that had that psychological side of dealing with the thing. So once I learned to read and write, I then did some exams. And one, I just scraped a pass in it. I mean, I just literally scraped, I just got over the line and passed, but I was delighted with that. And people go, oh, but you didn't get a very high grade. And you go, no, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I got over the line, that first one. And then I did the second one, I failed the second one. And then I did a degree. and then I did a master's degree, and then I did my doctoral degree. And then after that, I was at Cambridge University. And when I was at Cambridge University, I was in the Faculty of English. And the Faculty of English at Cambridge University is one of the best departments in an extraordinary university. But even then, I should have been very proud to have been there, and I was, but I was still too ashamed while I was there to tell people that I'd failed all of these exams in English all the way through. You know, I felt I had to pretend that I had a competent youth, that I you know, and of course that was ridiculous, but you still carry this idea of failure for so long. So yeah, so dance for me gave me a model of how to succeed. It gave me a way of chunking up and breaking down a language and learning it, understanding the social aspect of reading, thinking about the stories and thinking about the rhythm. So for me, I could read poetry before I could read long prose, because poetry had a rhythm to it. It also had lots of white space on it, so I could see more easily. But that rhythm in poetry was very engaging for me. Reading about people was more interesting than reading about abstract ideas, because the people had lives and I could connect with them on a personal level. When I started to read Freud, the science of Freud, some of it was so dense that I found it difficult to understand. But so I tried to understand as much about Freud as I could. And the more I understood about Sigmund Freud, the more I could understand about his writings, because of that engagement with him there. So there were those changes happening there. And then, of course, ultimately, I fell in love with a character. And when I first fell in love with a character in a book, then, of course, I had this emotional connection with it, and, which I love. And then, of course, I tried then to physicalize some bits of movement. And I would try to have a rhythm in things and try to read when I was moving. And reading and moving then helped me unlock some of those things. All the time I was thinking of reading as this kind of cognitive exercise of looking at the word rhythm and trying to understand rhythm and thinking, well, that pattern of letters simply does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. How does that create a word? How does the word yacht, how does that make that? That doesn't make sense either. But that's not a failing of me, that's a failing of that language. And once I got to that point and I thought, well, okay, this is a stupid language and I'm better than this language, then I'm going to try to battle and overcome it. And there are still words I don't get now, and there are still sentences I struggle with now. But I think, okay, well, that's an imperfect language system. I'm imperfect too, but it's not my fault. It's not my fault. That's a stupid language. Anyway, though I've gone on too long. I apologize.
No, please don't.
So that's yeah.
No, it's just been so amazing to speak with you. And in fact, as I hear you speak, I sort of connect with my own childhood. I've started understanding why I always enjoyed poetry more and why I couldn't sit in class still. And I really connect with each and every, and I failed at math. I just couldn't understand the numbers, but when I'm dancing, I can understand playing with rhythm or within that, within numbers. But yeah, it's really been such a pleasure to hear you speak and to read your books, and I'm really going to encourage everyone else too, because again, everything you say, everything you write is in a simple language also, like one can really, I think as a normal human being, you understand, you connect to it, you allow us to connect with this with so much ease and comfort. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely spending time with you today. And I hope one day we have a chance to talk in person.